Well, this is really a difficult commentary for me. Not just because I'm not knowledgeable of the Armenian language, but because of the complexity of the book like this. There is an aphorism by Karén Karslyan that states that a poem is only good until you get to know its author. And then you know its author and the poem is no longer good. So we had a brilliant demonstration of the contrary, because the book got better, still even better after not only getting to know the author, but listening to the author. Because one thing that became completely apparent that you can only read this book, between quotes, quotation marks, in a performative way. The only way to read, you have to, this is the kind of text that, as a matter of fact, literature in the 20th century has provided us with several other examples of objects we call books, but which demand a completely new way of reading, and which demand above all a performative way of reading. What interested, well, the first time I really heard about the book and listened to a first presentation about the book, of course this presentation by the author is a much richer and complex one, and I particularly liked to hear that the author is still figuring out right now what, because, and that's of course is why he did this in this way or the other, which is also a living proof of the complexities inherent in this type of construction, in that it never is quiet. It is a movable text, it is movable meaning, so it has to be performed, and the performance in each case may provide completely different results. But let me just offer 2 or 3 topics of reflection. And I was saying, as the first time I got acquainted, I heard of the book and I was presented to the book, was really the idea of dismemberment that then the organizers chose for the title of this talk. Because being familiar with classical ways of integrating violence and writing about violence, because violence is not a new topic, it is a topic as old as literature itself. The first texts in European tradition are texts about war, the Homeric poems, of course. But when one reads classical theorists, and I mean by classical theorists, Friedrich Schiller, for instance, who very much in his theory, in his aesthetic writings and his theory of the tragic, really write a lot about violence, about what he calls the pathetic pathos, the use of pathos in literature. But there is one central tenet that these writers and theoreticians always insist upon, that violence must not be allowed to disrupt the text. That is to say, violence is always, of course, something irritating, something you cannot easily accommodate, but the true demonstration of the power of the artist is to be able to integrate violence within a meaningful whole and not allow violence to be disruptive. And as a matter of fact, a main acquisition of literature and art in the 20th century was what someone calls the emancipation of the dissonance, to promote, to have disruption as a central goal to pursue, to abandon the way of some kind of organic whole where violence could become meaningful. Because I think, if I understood correctly, what the book is about, one of the things that precisely the book tries to put forward is that violence can never be peacefully accommodated into a structured meaning. Violence is always something that deeply disturbs, disrupts meaning, and the artist wants to find ways of dealing with that disruption. And I think that's precisely what is being done here. Of course, this was not just an aesthetic development, it has a lot to do with the very quality of violence. And also in that way, I think the book has a lot to offer, because one of the things that emerged in the representation of the First World War was really the total incommensurability between the language, public discourse, language that was used to talk about war, the figure of the hero, and so on. And when you are just torn to pieces by some kind of bomb, you have no time to be a hero. I'm reminded of a poem by a Portuguese poet, António Sousa Ribeiro, which was very important for me as a teenager. I was reminded of that poem at lunch, where you remember Portugal was involved in the colonial war, so the prospect of war was, for my generation, was a very concrete prospect. And the poet writes, it's not a very good poem, but anyway, it is. They had been taught how a hero behaves and so on, but they had no time, simply had no time to be here. So technological war gives a new, it's a totally new quality to destruction. It's mass destruction, but it's also technological destruction. It's industrially produced destruction. One way of looking at the First World War is as the deployment of an industry of destruction. The French writer Henri Barbusse talks about the soldiers as ouvriers de la destruction, the workers of destruction, as if they were in the trenches, like workers are in a factory plant. So this what becomes then a central topic is how using conventional language to approach the reality of war is a lie, is essentially a lie, and how you can get beyond that old lie of heroism and like in the very famous poem by Wilfred Owen, the old lie that it is dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, it is good and it is a moral thing to do, to die for one's own fatherland. So the way you treat language in this book, you really treat language as a very physical reality, and that allows you to take words literally and to provide the reader with a kind of approach where the physicality of words is in some sense a replication of the physical bodies that are also in question, like the burning, or because the first truth about war is that what happens in war is that human bodies are being torn apart, that humans are suffering, and that and all the nice words of conventional rhetorics about war are really unmasked as some kind of lie, disguising that deeper reality that an individual human body is being torn apart. Very much in the same sense, later after the Holocaust, Theodor Adorno produced his famous phrase that it would be barbaric to write poetry after Auschwitz. It is a much quoted, a much misinterpreted phrase. And I think simply what Adorno was trying to say was that you cannot go on using conventional language. If you want to write about war, you cannot use the conventions of lyrical poetry. You have somehow to find your own language. You have to work on language. And you have to, like the poet Paul Celan did, to be able to also, and it's very much what you do here too, because another central key word would be silence, to name your approach, because your use of language and the way you play with language, and the word play is here, I think, very adequate, very much. Of course, not in a frivolous sense, not in a trivial sense, but in a deeper sense. Well, essentially what you're doing is playing with the materiality of the words on page. That's why the typography of this book is overwhelming. It is incredible. I can imagine. You must have supervised very closely the printing of this book. So
I was in the printing house the whole time, like you were.
Yeah, I can see no other way of producing such an object. This is amazing, really, what has come out of the process. But anyway, this play with words is also, I think it is all the time very conscious of the very, very close connection there is between language and silence. And this is also a very thoughtful way of approaching this topic of sheer violence and war, to understand that war or extreme violence tends to reduce language to the minimum, and in the end tends to have language approach a condition of silence. And the way you play with this notion of silence, I think it's also so I think you are Adorno died a long time ago, but I think if Adorno were here, he would be, if I understand him correctly, he would find in you someone who has understood the deep sense of his dictum very, very profoundly and took it very seriously and set out to provide work on language in order to really also find an ethical way of approaching it. That is to say, it is not just you were not just faced with an aesthetic problem. I think you were very much faced, and that surfaced in your presentation, you were very much faced with an ethical problem. Because really, if you approach the violence of war in a trivial conventional matter, you are somehow mocking the dead. That is to say, in the end, you are almost killing them again. You are victimizing the victim again. And this is a problem that surfaces very much in the Holocaust literature, for instance. There is always this ethical problem of looking for justice, of doing justice to the ones who were killed, those who didn't even have the right to have a nice photograph, whose remains are just blood pictures of themselves and some words, some conventional words. And that's a way of, in some sense, killing them again. So the ethical task of really doing justice, I think it's, I have no other way to say it. It's moving. It's really moving to try to understand and to realize how the type of effort that was put in to do justice. So I never thought in my life I would be sorry not to be able to understand Armenian, but this the time came. It's too late for me now. But anyway, I'm deeply grateful for your book, for your presentation. And okay, I think I stop here.
We don't have too much time. Then I will not read, even try to present something. You know, when you invited me to bring my part to this encounter, I had to decide, or simply to understand what it was that was expected from me. And then in front of this, in French they would say an ovni, in English an UFO, an unidentified flying object. And the question was first, was I supposed to bring to the audience, to you, some reflections on this subject, or was I supposed to detach myself, or we were supposed maybe to detach ourselves from the book and to maybe to develop some philosophical reflections on the possible or impossible connection between art and war. And as you said, actually they are incompatible. And that was my first reaction. And this is where I first understood, what I first understood of what was expected from me, and it was the main reason why I accepted the invitation to speak here. That was the second possibility. The third possibility was maybe to bring some geopolitical knowledge in order to give a context to this production. I tried to, I apologize, I tried to read like this what I've written, to bridge. This typographical film, because it is what it says about itself, is obviously Armenian. It has been published in 2016, a few months after a new outburst of violence and war at the borders of the country. And yes, its author is originated from that country, where he has his roots and also his readers, I would say his constituency. But he has been living in California for more than 10 years now. I don't know exactly how long. And he is part of a new Armenian diaspora, rapidly spreading new dispersion, consecutive to the first dispersion of the Armenians a century ago, the one of Western Armenians, which took place a century ago, as I said, as a consequence of which the people who still call themselves Armenian are spread today all over the world. And this reality, this one, the one of the dispersion, is also part of the geopolitical knowledge that we would need to take into account in order to situate this typographical production within a context. The question being then, which context exactly? Should it be the context of the Caucasus, of a country which is locked up within a closed borders that are worse than walls, a country which is submitted to a continuous and undeclared state of war, or should it be the context of the dispersion, which is also the context of the author, by the way, new context that began a century ago for the Western fragment of these people, the fragment that lived in the Ottoman Empire, the dispersion that is now an ongoing phenomenon also for the Eastern fragment, the one which is supposed to have a country and the state, the one that benefits from what they call sovereignty. Then, you see, we had three possible approaches and so many questions. With the first approach, the interpretive one, in summary, the main question would have been to select meaningful elements in this visual object in order to confer it some sort of intelligibility related to the possible connection between war and art, because I repeat, there is no connection at all imaginable between war and art. With the second approach, the philosophical one, independently of the visual object, independently of it, the challenge would have been to find a conceptual bridge between war and art. And with the third approach, the search for a geopolitical context, of course, the question would have been to find a way for defining a possible art in a predicament of pure dispersion. In simple terms, what art in a diaspora? Answer the question, please, for yourself. It doesn't mean that individuals cannot practice art outside of defined political borders. It just means that we would need to define an artistic practice, an artistic production in explicit relation with the absence of sovereignty, or in explicit relation with, let's say, an endangered sovereignty. Then let's take a look at this, and probably this will be what I will bring to this discussion here today to you. In the common language, the word sovereignty has two meanings. The one external, the other one internal. In Armenian, there are two words for sovereignty. Ինքնիշխանություն, քերիշխանություն. Which correspond to these two meanings, external and internal, respectively. The internal sovereignty is the sovereignty of the sovereign. Whoever the sovereign may be. The king or the people. The external sovereignty is the sovereignty of the state. Or more generally, the sovereignty of any subject of law. And it's a very modern expression, subject of law. The idea of sovereign states began in the 17th century, treaties of Westphalia and so on, but of course they didn't have the expression of subject of law to explain to themselves what the sovereign state is. Then, I repeat, I cannot explain more, I apologize, but then the sovereignty of, the external sovereignty is the sovereignty of the state, the sovereignty of any subject of law, to the extent that he, a person, or it, state, is really subjected to a law that he or it contributed to establish. You are a subject of the subject of the sovereign, but you are the sovereign at the same time because you establish the law you are obeying to. In all European languages, there are one single word for these two meanings. It's very interesting. In all European languages. In Armenian, there are two. I will examine another time with you, if you invite me again, whether there is only one word for two different notions, or whether in Armenian there are two words for one concept. If these two notions amount to the same, maybe. And at the very beginning of his unfinished book on sovereignty, which I'm speaking of Georges Bataille, this book, which was programmed, as you know, as a third volume of the series on the accursed share, Georges Bataille writes the following. He says at the very beginning, the sovereignty of which I'm speaking has little to do with the sovereignty of the states, defined by international law. Wow! Then Georges Bataille, why is it the same word if it has nothing to do? He doesn't ask himself the question. That's very interesting. He knew how to dissociate one meaning of the word from the other one, but he did not want to know anything about the double meaning of the word. And if for him sovereignty was defined by a pure expenditure without accumulation, because what sovereignty was for him. Then his problem was how to make this pure expenditure dépense in French possible in the objective word without war. This is said explicitly at the end of the book, the written part of it. He says, la guerre est en passe d'être bientôt la banqueroute frauduleuse du genre humain. War is on the way of becoming soon the fraudulent bankruptcy of the human species. And almost on the last page, le problème dont je parle, l'épuisement sans guerre de l'excédent. The problem I'm speaking about, the exhaustion of the excess without war. Which was precisely with that which is impossible in the objective world that we know. There is no nothing like that possible, of course not. The one in which there is the word that we know, the objective one, the one in which there is our word, the one in which there is no sovereignty without power, without violence, without war, without the supposition of war. There is no sovereignty without war. And of course, in the definition itself, I mean. And of course, then Bataille had no other recourse but to define a subjective process of sovereignty, which is the one of art, of what he called precisely sovereign art, l'art souverain. And to call for a strict separation between sovereignty in the objective world and the sovereignty of art, in order to define, he says, I quote, the place and the meaning of the man of sovereign art in this world. In order to define himself, he had then to, again, dissociate the objective world in which sovereignty is related with war in all cases without exception, and himself as the man of sovereign art, the only one, by the way, there is no other one than himself, and Nietzsche, of course. Then the one for whom maybe it is imaginable to have sovereignty without war, and that's art. Wow, we have the conceptual framework for thinking here about a possible relation, an impossible relation, but a relation nonetheless between war and art. And the man of sovereign art, he says, is the only one who can measure up with the disproportionate catastrophe in the threat of which we are living. Il est à la mesure de cette catastrophe démesurée dans la menace de laquelle nous vivons. Who? The man of sovereign art, himself, and Nietzsche. Bataille is thus the only author that I know who tried to conceptualize the possibility of sovereignty without power. There is no sovereignty without power. He is the only one who tried to conceptualize the possibility of sovereignty without power. Which means without war, without the presupposition of war. But he is also the only one who, through his insistence on sovereignty, his obsession with sovereignty, was able to establish then a conceptual bridge, as I explained, between war and art, which also gives us some empirical answer to the third question: what art in the predicament of absolute dispersion? What art in the dispersion? And a sovereignty without power, is that possible? The answer: of course it is impossible, sovereignty without power. Precisely, art tells the impossible. It is not made to tell us what is possible. The diaspora is a bearer, I mean the dispersion, because the diaspora is the place where there is no sovereignty. The diaspora is the bearer of that impossible, the incarnation, the future of that impossible. Now you see, I wrote 2 pages here about the book, about about the wall, about war and wall. War is bad. War is Aterazma. I will skip, because we heard the author speak about that. I will just translate again for myself as he translated at the end, at the very end, these 2 sentences which are the backbone of what he wants to say. Yet a mere groom, then I translate. If in a given country there is someone who is able to break himself or herself up in the wall of a fortress, he says, and mur, then that country and that people are invincible, cannot be defeated. And then the last one, yet a mere translation, if a country is able to release the one who is bricked up in the wall of the fortress, to release, to liberate, to free, then that country are invincible, and so on, and that people are invincible. Yes, of course. On the last page we have again the same sentence in Lazari Turkish. There is clearly a message here addressed by the author to his fellow Armenians and to all Azeris, probably all those who are able to hear the message, to liberate the boy, the one who is necessarily, inevitably enclosed in the wall of sovereignty, of all sovereignties, to liberate him from the internal violence and the internal power supposed and always carried out by the idea and the reality of sovereignty. Is that possible? Of course it is impossible. It is tantamount to imagine, again, a sovereignty without violence, without internecine violence, or without internal power. And we arrive then at the same conclusion than as the end of the first part. Is it impossible, I asked, and I answered, of course it is impossible. Art tells the impossible. It is not made to tell us what is possible. And now let me read one more page. Almost 100 years ago, in 1921, another Armenian writer, Levon, who was a Western Armenian, who had studied in Echmiadzin, and he became an Eastern Armenian. We are very interesting. He is the only one, there is no other. He is the exception. There is no communication between Western and Eastern in the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. Who was a successful playwright, and at the same time a political activist. Wrote a drama called The Unchained, in Armenian Shkayvazin. A play, a drama that I'm sure he doesn't know. Because what is Western Armenia or what is the diaspora is totally unknown in Armenia. And this totally unknownness, if I may so, of what concerns the diaspora in Armenia is a phenomenon by itself. Then wrote a drama called The Unchained, which he read before a chosen audience, a political audience, in the immediate aftermath of the downfall of the First Republic. We are in 1921, the spring of 1921, in extremely tragic and even disastrous circumstances, just after the Republic had been taken up in the lap of the Soviet Union after a short period of civil war. Shant was on the way of exile, an exile that would prove to be without hope and without return. But if exile is a human and collective predicament away from sovereignty, is it? Yes, it is. He had already been in exile before the birth of the Republic, because the Republic lasted just 2 years. There were 2 years of sovereignty, if you want. In any case, the same was also true for his first auditors. They had fought for the sovereignty of their country. They had fought for the sovereignty of their country. They had fought for the sovereignty of their country. They had fought for the sovereignty of their country. They had fought for the sovereignty of their country. They had fought for the sovereignty of their country. They had fought for the sovereignty of their country. They had fought for the sovereignty of their country. They had fought for the sovereignty of their country. They had fought for the sovereignty of their country. They had fought for the sovereignty of their country. They had fought for the sovereignty of their country. They had fought for the sovereignty of their country. They had fought for the sovereignty of their country. They had fought for the sovereignty of their country. They had fought for the sovereignty of their country. They had fought for the sovereignty of their country. They had fought for the sovereignty of their country. They had fought for the sovereign and they had been defeated in their efforts. The Enchained of the title of the drama is Adavast, the one who in the Armenian legend is forever bricked up or unmute, locked up in the cave. And it's the same as the Georgian legend, which has the boy bricked up in the wall. In the play, a prophet named Nagash calls for a revolution. He calls for a liberation of Ardavast from his chains. A call that everyone in the play understands as a call for a political revolution. But to work for a political revolution means to work for the return of power. You destroy one, you establish another one. One way or another. Through this, and that's why it is called the revolution, by the way. It's an eternal return of power. Through his emphasis on this eternal return of power, Chant actually offers a fierce criticism of sovereign power in general. And he raises a messianic claim, and the word, I insist on the word, a messianic claim for the end of that power. And like all messianisms, of course, it's a critique. It's a critical discourse. A messianic claim for the end of that power, for any power, exactly like Walter Benjamin was doing in the same years, exactly the same way. When he wrote in his 1922 essay, so Critique der Gewalt, usually translated as Critique of Violence in English, but which should be translated with no less accuracy as Critique of Sovereign Power. Gewalt is power, in German it's not violence, or it is, but it's also power, of course. That article also could be read, the one of Walter Benjamin, and understood in different ways, just like Chant's drama. It stated something about history, about the coupled sovereignty power from the point of view of the end of history, the messianisms of that, which Benjamin called divine violence, had at least one purpose: to predict the possibility of a revolution on this earth, a historical one, but it had also the purpose of criticizing every revolution to the extent that every revolution re-establishes the same type of sovereign power. There is no other. Now, coming back to the author of The Unchained, Léon Chant, the problem is that the same Léon Chant, this time as a political activist and as a party member, which he also was, wrote in the same years, 1922-23, a series of essays and articles where he explained that a people or a nation worthy of that name is defined by the will to power, that inhabits at its core, a will to power which could be understood more precisely as a will to sovereignty, a will to sovereign power. And he was saying exactly the contrary of what he said in the play, in the political articles. That's a usual contradiction of everyone. Of course, at the same time, that will to sovereign power and that conception of a political party as being the incarnation of that will to power were the justification of the protracted existence of that very same political party in the diaspora. In a situation, it's the Tashnats, in a situation where we could have thought that there was nothing to do for a political party, the diaspora, the dispersion, there is no policy anymore. And then it's the last paragraph. Fortunately, or hopefully, there is no political activist in Karén Karslyan, although I am not sure. But maybe Karén himself will give us today, but now it's too late, political translation of his call. His call to release the boy who is bricked up in the wall. Was it a call for a political revolution? Or was it a messianic claim for the end of any sovereign power? which is, as I said, in the case of Levonchant and Walter Benjamin, would be tantamount to a general critique of sovereign power. And that's my question. Thank you very much.